Today on Art Matters with Mr. Morris,
The Elements of Design!
refresher course.
Da 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 da. Da 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 da. Woo! Da 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 da. Da 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 da. Woo! Da 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 da. Art Matters with Mr. Morris. Yeah.
Welcome back, my artists. Today, we are going to briefly be covering aspects of the elements of design. We're not going to cover quite all of them today, but we're going to cover quite a few of them. So stick around, pay attention. This is the right time to take some notes because your studio this week, you're going to be employing almost all of these elements of design in your own artwork. I find the easiest way to remember the elements of design is to remember them in a little bit of a phrase. Lines become shapes. Shapes become pattern. Patterns become textures. Textures can have color. Color has value. Value shows form. Now, even if you have all those memorized, it doesn't tell you what they are. So let's get into that. The elements of design are a lot like building blocks. You see, the artwork is made from the elements, but that doesn't necessarily tell us what the artwork looks like. So think of it this way. If I take a whole bunch of Lego bricks and I dump them into a big pile, each Lego brick would be an element. There's different kinds of Lego bricks, there's different kinds of elements. Maybe this Lego brick represents line and this Lego brick represents shape. And then even within that, there's variations within shape, for instance. So maybe this is an open shape, this is a closed shape, this is a organic shape, this is a geometric shape. Each element has its own variance within itself. When you put these elements together, it creates what we see as the artwork, or as the scribble, or as whatever it may be. It shows us the visual elements of the work. From there we can talk about how are those elements arranged. That's where we get into what are called the principles of design. Our principles of design we're going to refresh on a future lesson, but for right now, I want you to think of them this way. If the elements are the individual Lego blocks, the principles are the way in which we arrange those Lego blocks. So think of it this way. If I have a Minecraft instruction set and I have a Jurassic World instruction set for a Lego set, in either case, I can use Legos to create either one of those. I use elements to create the finished product. However, the way the finished product is put together, what elements it uses changed. In other words, the principles of design rely on the elements. Without the elements of art, there are no principles of design. We need the parts to make the whole. So what kinds of elements are there? Well, so let's break down each one of our elements that we're going to cover today. And we'll get into some of the individual parts of those elements that you need to know to do this week's lesson.
All right, our first element of art to go over is line, and you may not think that there's a lot of variation in what a line can be, but I assure you there's a ton of variation in it. Now, there's two ways that you can describe a line. One is by direction that it's going, and then the other one is by the line's qualities itself. When we describe a line by saying it's a zigzag line or a loop-de-loop line, well, that's telling us the direction the line's going. It's not telling us about the line itself. Today we're only going to focus on the line's qualities itself. So a line can be straight, or a line can also be curved. A line can be short, like this dot, and a line can be long. A line can be thick and it can be thin. When a line goes from being thick to thin and back to thick to thin, and it kind of varies how its width goes, we call that a variable line. And when a line is kind of broken apart like a dotted line, or like what you see here on the screen, we call that an intermittent line. I can also have lines that are light and lines that are dark. By using different kinds of lines, you can make your artwork look more interesting. Here's a plain apple with one type of line, but then next to it I'm going to draw in the second apple with variable line pressure, light and darks. And you see it looks very different, it looks more dynamic. And that's how I can get a lot of different variation in all my drawings, is by varying the way I use the element that we call line. I guess you could say that variety is the apple of life, or the apple to my eye. I don't know. I'm just winging it here. Lines become shapes. That's the First, one of our phrases that we have to remember is lines do become shapes. Now, if a shape has a name or you see it in math, we call those geometric shapes. Those would be squares and triangles and right angles and circles and ovals and rectangles and ellipses and so on and so forth. Anything that has a specific name, it's geometric. When, though, you have shapes and they don't have a name and they're all wibble-wobbly and don't look like anything specific, we call those organic shapes. So the shape of your kitty cat would be organic versus the shape of a triangle is, well, it's geometric. If a shape has no hard edges, we call that soft. And if it looks like it has spiky points or hard edges, we call that a hard shape. So any shape that has curves in it and no angles, that's going to be a soft shape. And any shape that has hard angles or corners is going to be a hard shape. When you see a shape like the circle here, and you see that it has that open gap where it didn't get closed, we call that an open shape. And in comparison with the trapezoid next to it, we call that a closed shape because it doesn't have any openings. Pretty simple, but it's good to know these terms when you're doing your art making. Now, things aren't always cut and dry. Obviously, with any of my elements, they can have variables. This shape right here is an open shape, but it has geometric aspects, and it has hard aspects, but it also has organic aspects, and it also has soft corners. So it's kind of a combination of a lot of different types of shapes in one shape. And that's kind of how the elements work. They're flexible, and they can be kind of mixed together. All right, so lines become shapes, and shapes become pattern. If I put shapes together, it creates a pattern. Anything can be a pattern so long as it repeats. And I'm going to say that again. Anything can be a pattern so long as it repeats. And I'm going to say that one more time. Anything can be a pattern so long as it repeats. When a pattern repeats, but it doesn't change at all, we call that a repeating or uniform pattern. Versus if a pattern changes, then we would call that an alternating or variable pattern. So lines become shapes, shapes become patterns, and patterns become texture. And texture just is simply a way of describing how something looks like it feels or how it actually feels. This tree looks like it has a rough bark texture to it, and it actually does have that texture. If I walk up to it, it has that texture, so we call that actual texture. In comparison, this picture I drew of a cow, it looks fluffy like a cow, but it's not actually fluffy. It's not really there. So in this case, we say it looks fluffy, but it doesn't feel fluffy, so we call this simulated texture. Our last type of texture is a little hard to understand, but stick with me. In this image, you see an artwork called Luncheon and Fur by the artist Merritt Oppenheim. In this artwork, she has given a texture that's an actual texture to something that doesn't normally have that texture. She's taken the normal porcelain texture you'd expect to see on this little teacup, and she's made it fuzzy. It's an actual texture because it looks like how it would feel, but it's not the correct texture, so we call this abstract texture.
That's about all I have today, students. Hopefully you now have a better understanding of what the elements of art, elements of design, sometimes I flip those two. Hopefully today you have a better understanding of what the elements of art are and how they influence your artwork itself.
Today we went over the elements of art: line, shape, pattern, texture, color, value, and form. I took you over the descriptions of line, shape, pattern, and texture, and we talked about the different types of these elements and different variations that you see in each one of them. Last, we talked about how the elements relate to the principles of design.
I am proud of you. I am proud of what you are doing and what you are creating in this class. Until next time, please remember, be kind to yourself and keep on making art. I'm Mr. Morris. Bye.